All right, let's talk about monasticism in the early church. Okay, so there is a bit of a crisis once Christianity becomes legal in the Roman Empire. Okay, and I'm not talking about the Arian crises or any of the other theological problems. All right, in a sense, this is actually a deeper issue to solve. Okay, for 300 years, being a Christian was basically an act of defiance. Just the act of committing yourself to Jesus put yourself in peril. Okay, early Christians were very, very serious about the faith. Okay, the clear and present danger of martyrdom vanished with the Edict of Milan, at least within the Roman Empire, and conversion to Christianity became safe and eventually actually very politically advantageous. All right, the rich and powerful gained dominance in the church, corruption spread through the clergy. Now that the church was free to flourish without threat of persecution, the church faced this deeper existential problem. How can one be a true Christian in a time of laxity, of growing corruption? How does one be a true Christian when the church and the world seem to be merging into one entity? Okay, the legalization felt like a blessing to some and it felt like a snare to others. I think these are really deep and important questions that we still need to think about. Okay. Now, for many people, the solution to this problem was actually monasticism. All right, a commitment to virginity and asceticism became a new type of sacrifice and a new type of martyrdom. This pattern of rejecting society to embrace solitude or communal living outside the mainstream became increasingly popular. Monasticism didn't begin in the 4th century after the conversion of the empire. The most famous of the desert ascetics, St. Anthony of the Desert, for example, retreated to the Egyptian desert prior to Constantine's conversion. But it was after Constantine that the movement kind of exploded in popularity. Okay, the practices really range from regimented to fanatical. All right. So the very first monastics were solitary. Okay. Both men and women would kind of escape from society, generally go to the desert, though not always, to devote themselves to life of prayer and penance. Okay. By far the most famous of these early desert monastics was St. Anthony of the Desert. Okay. So I've got a picture of him up on the screen. Isn't this great? All right. He was born to an affluent Egyptian family, and when his parents died, he was a young man, probably 18, 20, somewhere in there. He put his little sister in a convent, gave away all of their possessions, and then went to go live as a hermit in the desert. He would regularly battle with the devil and demons out there. And Life of St. Anthony of the Desert, or St. Anthony of Egypt, was written by Athanasius in 357. This was a really popular book. It was like popular reading for Christians. Okay. So a few things to note here. He is the most famous, but he's not the first. You'll notice he actually drops his sister out at a convent before he goes. So we know there's already some organized monastic houses where he's at, okay? But Anthony does give you some great stories of spiritual battles out in the desert. Whether you believe in literal demons or not, this life would have been really intense. You know, I don't know if he met actual demons or if he was hallucinating because he hadn't eaten a real meal in years. But these battles for him were very, very real. Okay, these early desert monastics were often pretty extreme, eating nothing but bread, water, and salt, never bathing, hardly sleeping, and self-harm was a regular occurrence. What is interesting about this phenomenon is that these ascetics go out to the desert to escape the world, but the world follows them. Okay, Christian tourism booms. The faithful flock out to the desert to see these holy people in action. They want to learn from them. Sometimes they stay in the desert, kind of attaching themselves to a particular Abba, father, Amma, mother to learn. And sometimes they just want to visit, kind of glean what they can, and then go back to their regular lives. Okay? And these monastics become authorities in their own way, okay? This authority springs from their actions, not from hierarchy. Okay, so kind of the rise of monastic houses then were an inevitability. All right, people were flocking to see these monastics. They wanted to learn from them. They wanted to live with them. Okay, so right now I have Pacomius up on the screen. He's really recognized as kind of the father of Cenobitic monasticism, which means like living together. Okay, he was Egyptian. He was born in Thebes around the end of the 3rd century to pagan parents who provided him a good education. And according to sources, he was conscripted into Constantine's army about 315. Remember, Constantine's waging a lot of wars at this point, okay? And during this time, Christians would actually bring food to the conscripted soldiers, and Pacomius was really, really moved by this, and he wanted to become a Christian. So he actually was baptized after his time in the army had ended. If you recall, you actually could not be a soldier and a Christian, so he had to wait until his kind of like term of duty was up, and then he converted. Okay, so Pacomius wanted to be a desert monastic, all right? He learned from a desert father. He lived as a hermit for a while, but he felt God calling him to build a monastery, which he did. And his sister Mary built a monastery nearby for women as well. Okay, so while there had been small communities of monks and nuns living together before, Pacomius is really the first person to write a rule of community order. Okay, this becomes important, and we're going to see lots of different monastic rules kind of over the course of this class, all right? So things that he required: all property was held in common. The monks and the nuns supported themselves by weaving, by making baskets, kind of other means of production, all right? They supported themselves, they worked, all right? That's an important aspect of it. There was regular meals together in silence, and there was no eating meat or drinking alcohol. And members were congregated multiple times a day to pray or read the Psalms. Okay, so those who entered the monastery, if they couldn't read, they were taught, thus starting this long tradition of monasteries and convents being places of learning. There was always a mother or father who led the communities, and the monks and nuns were expected to study together and care for each other's spiritual well-being. Okay, Pacomius' rule really caught on, and lots of people visited his communities. Among these was Basil the Great, who's kind of considered the father of Eastern monasticism. Okay, so what you really see here is that these monastic houses provided stability. They created a regimented lifestyle, but they also protected against really extreme forms of asceticism and self-harm. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about urban monasticism, particularly Marcella. Okay. Marcella was born in 325, and she was a wealthy member of the aristocracy. Her father died when she was young, and she married, as was expected of her, at a young age. After 7 months, her husband died, leaving her a very young widow, like, mid-teenage years, okay? Her mother tried to arrange a second marriage, this time to a much older, wealthy man, and Marcella just refused. Jerome, who we're going to talk about in another video, reports that Marcella learned of the monastic life from some Alexandrian priests who were seeking refuge in Rome. And from them, she learned about Anthony of the Desert, who was then actually still alive, and of Pacomius, all right? And unlike those who fled society to live in a monastic community in the desert, Marcella created a spiritual haven right there in Rome, okay? Marcella took a vow of celibacy and opened her home to other women who were pursuing a spiritual life, kind of imitating these monasteries that she was hearing about. Jerome reports that Marcella lived as an ascetic for many years, but she wasn't real extreme. She fasted moderately, she abstained from meat, she would only drink wine for medicinal purposes. Okay, so she kept a disciplined life, but she wasn't real fanatical. Okay. Conversely, though, her younger sister, Acella, who lived kind of in the community, was far more extreme and chose to live in complete solitude. Okay. Marcella became a very respected biblical scholar, especially regarding interpretation and translation. She studied with Jerome, and actually, it was known in the city, like priests would come and get her opinion on scripture. So pretty interesting. Marcella continued at her urban monastery until Rome was sacked in the year 410. Gothic soldiers broke into her home looking for gold. She told them she didn't have any because she probably gave it all away, and they beat her severely. Then, maybe moved by compassion or guilt for beating an old lady, the men dropped her off at a basilica for refuge until it was safe for her to come home, but she died soon after from her injuries.